Pastor Bobby, let's get going in Exodus 15. What do you say?
What do y'all think about Pastor Chuck's dance moves so far? Y'all up for that?
I noticed you didn't ask me what I thought about him.
What did you think about him?
Killing it up here.
Yeah?
Killing it.
I have a feeling that's going to turn into one of those GIFs that people share, and on a Monday morning when we're just like banging our heads against computers, there's going to be Pastor Chuck doing this on our screens. I think that's going to be pretty awesome.
Okay.
Well, it's great to have you back home, and thank you for being the kind of pastor that leads the way and having a big heart. We show some love to our pastor today and just all the things. Man, Pastor Chuck never is just sitting back chilling. He's like, what can we do? And we're so grateful for that. If you're new around here, we've been in, I think, a 7-week series now through the book of Exodus. And we've been calling this the journey towards freedom. And I think for a lot of us, that's the journey we're on. We're in the sense of, man, there's a place we're going, right? So for the nation of Israel, there was something God promised for them. Hey, one day you're going to enter the promised land, but they weren't there yet. Yeah. And there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of tension. God, are you there? God, are you going to remember that promise? Are we ever going to get to a place of freedom? Yeah. And I think for a lot of us, that's where we live. Sometimes we think freedom ought to be this thing that just magically happens. One prayer, one thing, one song, we're done. But I think anytime I've said that over the last couple of weeks, there's heads nodding because I think all of us have experienced that freedom is actually a process, that it actually takes time. That if you are in the journey, here's what I believe. I think all of us are on this journey towards freedom. I think we often stall out in the journey. At least in my own story, there's been certainly times that I feel like I've grown stagnant. But what I believe is what God wants to do today is he wants to meet us where we are and help us to take the next step towards freedom. And whatever that freedom looks like for you. For some of you, it's a substance thing. For some of you, it's an addiction. For some of you, it's freedom in a relationship. For some of you, maybe you've never given your hearts and your life to Christ. It's going to look different for all of us, but essentially what Pastor Chuck and I want to do today is we want to show you some of those stages towards freedom, some of those mile markers, if you will, some of those pit stops along the way, and basically show you the big picture of this journey. And then at the end of the day, ask the question, where are you in the journey, and are you willing to take the next step? Does that make sense? That sound okay to you guys? As we wrap this up today, we really want to move towards freedom.
Yeah, you know, there are people in this room who are good about A and Z. And then most of us need to know, yeah, but what do I do B to Y? Right? I mean, like, I get it, right? Alpha, Omega, you know, beginning and end. I know what Jesus did. I know where I'm going. I got all that. But in the middle, why do I have so much garbage in my life? Yeah. And how do I get there? So when I was reading and studying while I was in Uvalde, and it hit me that freedom and forgiveness are really similar in that it rarely, if ever, happens in a moment. Yeah. You rarely just can forgive. It's typically a season you're working through because it's an inside job, right? But freedom is much like that. Freedom is not really so much about this external rights we enjoy. Freedom is being able to live at peace, not just with God and not just with others, but almost amazingly and seem impossibly at times to live at peace within. And so finding this freedom it's a journey. I mean, it's throughout this whole text today. Yeah. Like when we start off and Moses starts singing this song of Moses, and then Miriam sings the song of Miriam. And I find it interesting that the story of Exodus it is about this journey to freedom, but in a lot of ways it's about how God shows up in those moments. That's right. You know, like when your life just totally has wrecked, where's God, right? When things are just awesome, where's God? And it's important to see because this Old Testament, I mean, regardless of what people may say, this Old Testament is so significant in our lives today because we are presently living the life of the Old Testament people of Israel. I mean, we're living it out right in front of our eyes. Yep. So when I look at what this looks like, I think to myself, let's forget that freedom happens overnight. Yeah. That freedom is a process, and that we serve a process God. Yeah. We serve a God. And I would just stop and say before you kind of head off into, your points, because I love it how Bobby has points. They're always
I
alliterated.
think every sermon I have at least 1 point.
Yeah.
I think.
I rarely have any. So together we're going to hit the middle today. But I would just say to you, many of you are at a stage in your life right now and you're trying to think, all right, God, where are you and how come things aren't working my way? I was with a guy right before I left to go to Uvalde, and then I was with a Border Patrol agent down in Eagle Pass the other day, and it was the same conversation. And it sounded like this: God, where the heck are you? I need you to show up right now. So I'm on the border, I'm talking to this guy, and his wife was just diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And I'm like, wow. But right before I left, I got a guy whose wife just walked in and said, I'm leaving, I don't love you anymore. And same challenge both men are wrestling with. It's like, God, where the heck are you? Right? And here's what I want you to get before we jump into the text and everything else. I want you to remember this phrase: we serve a not yet God sometimes. Because God's going to allow all of us, none of us are immune from this. God's going to allow us to live in the garbage times of life so that he can teach us not just how bad things can be so he can appreciate it when it's good, but to teach us what he needs us to know as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And it doesn't matter whether it's in your business, in your marriage, with your children, we are all going to walk through it.
Yeah.
But God has a purpose, a rhyme, and a reason, and often he says to us, but it's not yet, because I'm going to walk you through this journey. And I find it so cool, Bobby, because you and I see it a lot. Like I see it in your life, you probably see it in mine, where all of a sudden you see God redeeming those days that seem like they just radically stink. And God starts to redeem those, and it's like, oh, you were there walking with me. You know this junk, and now you're redeeming. Let God do his not yet work.
Yeah.
Because you've got to live the process. That old phrase, trust the process, could never be more true than in this text.
Yeah. And oftentimes we're not patient enough to do that.
Yeah.
So today we're going to look at Exodus chapter 15. So if you want to follow along in your own Bible app, or on the screen, we're going to take sort of this snapshot from Moses and Miriam and what the nation of Israel experienced, and then use that as a metaphor for the stages of us moving towards freedom. In fact, if you look at the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews looks back on this Exodus as a way of picturing freedom in the life of the believer. And the first place that every journey towards freedom starts is what we would call the stage of rescue.
Yeah.
The stage of rescue. So Moses starts writing this in Exodus 15, and he starts writing the song because he's on the other side of the Red Sea. And listen to what he says in Exodus 15, verse 1. It says, then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord. And here's the quote: I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both horse and rider into the sea. What they're referring back to is this major thing through the Red Sea.
Yeah.
It was not something that most of the Israelites honestly expected.
Right.
You know, if you know the story of the Israelites, they wanted to get out of slavery. They wanted to get into freedom. But as soon as Moses started leading them, they started to grumble.
Yeah.
We've talked about that, and we'll talk about it today too. And yet there comes this moment where they've got the Red Sea on one side of them. They've got the armies of Egypt coming up on the other side of them, and there comes a moment where they're like, we have no place to go.
Right.
We have no way out of this. We can't figure this out ourselves. And God uses Moses lifting up that staff that we talked about last week from Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 4, and God does what only he can do. The waters part, and the Bible's crystal clear to say they pass through on dry ground. That is the stage of rescue. This first stage for us, honestly, is salvation.
Right.
That in any one of our lives, there comes a moment where we realize, man, I'm separated from God. I'm captive to my own sin. I can try harder, I can try to do better, all that's great, but I can't fix it myself. And there comes this moment in our lives where we realize there is only one answer, and that answer simply is Jesus. It's the stage of salvation where we make that swap. It's the stage of salvation where we said, God, I can't I know that you can. Right. God, I can't fix it myself, but I know that you sent Jesus die on the cross to rise again, and as best as I can, I put my faith in you. And that has to happen for all of us. I know you've told your story a little bit, but do you mind talking about when that moment was for you? That you put your
I'll
faith
do
in
super
Christ?
short. I'm sitting on this front row, and I'm listening to this massive human being that's a professional football player for the Cleveland Browns give the story of salvation. Mm-hmm. And it was like I was the only dude in the room. And this guy is like, so if you've got nowhere to go, you got nothing to do, you realize you can't fix all your junk on your own. Yeah. And it's like, you need to trust Christ with your life right now, not just for heaven, but for all, and I'm sitting there thinking, he's talking to me. Yeah. And he said, so if you want to settle Christ in your life right now, just call on the name of the Lord. And I'm like, I don't have any idea what the guy's talking about. Like, that is such preacher talk to me, like call on the name, like what in the world? And he made it so simple. It was like, this is how you call on the name of the Lord. Jesus, I believe you died for me and you rose from the dead for me and you did that for my sin. So would you forgive me? And I'm like, I'm saying it out loud. I'm all in, right? And this big dude is going on. And he says, I want to turn my life around. I want to live for you. And I'm like, I want to turn my life around. I want to live for you. You know, I don't even know what it means yet, right? Yeah. And I'm all in. And then he finally gets to this part where he says, I'm going to trust you with all my life. Mm. And I was like, God, I'm going to trust you with all my life. And I look back all these years now. And you know, one of the most wonderful things that I find about my relationship with Christ, and I believe anybody who's been a believer for any amount of time would find this. Back to the 15th chapter. If you're a man and you've already checked out in the room, would you come back to me for a minute? Right, I get it. Y'all are already checking to see what you're going to do tomorrow in your calendar and your to-do list. I got it, right? Just come back to me for just a minute. Listen to chapter 15, verse 3. The Lord is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and army he hurled into the sea. The finest of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters gushed over them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. Your right hand is glorious in power. Your right hand smashes the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow those who are against you. And you know what I'm thinking? I'd like to believe I'm like a man's man. I'd like to believe that. But you know, when I read that, you know what I hear? I don't hear a sissy Jesus. I hear a Jesus who says, I will go before you in that boardroom and I will take care of business. Yeah. I will go to that job site and I will take care of business. When your kid comes home is out of control, I'll take care of business. When your wife, your husband is out of control, I will take care of business. And I think to myself, this stage of salvation is when you decide, I want Jesus to take care of my business. Yeah. And if you're from South Georgia, you want him to take care of your business. I just wanted to add that. Sorry, I got fired up there.
I love it. And I think there's going to be moments in our life that if we're not careful, the older we get, the more comfortable we become oftentimes.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think God will often stir, I don't know, lack of a better word, stir the pot in our lives to get our attention. Yeah. And so maybe you feel like you've been hitting your head against the wall and you feel like you're not making any progress and you feel like it's one step forward and two steps back. I would ask you to consider, has there ever been a moment that you've been rescued? Has there ever been a moment where you said, I need Jesus in my life? And if not, you can do that today. So that's stage one, what we call the stage of rescue. But they don't stay there.
No, because Moses leads them away. And I want you to get this in your picture. They leave the Red Sea, right? 3 days later. 3 days. We're not talking about months. We're talking about 3 days later. He takes them to this place and let me just read it to you. So we're in verse 22 in chapter 15. Then Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled in this desert for 3 days without finding any water. And when they came to the oasis of Marah, the water was too bitter to drink. So they called the place bitter. I mean, I've had that water, like when it's gross. You have too. Like, you know, you turn the faucet on, it's kind of brown. You know what I mean? It's like when Laura gets in my car, she sees a water bottle. She's learned to ask me, is that fresh water? Or is that from the water fountain at the gym from like 5 days ago? Or is it backwash? Well. But I mean, you know, it could be Bobby. He could be having a spit cup. I don't know. I mean,
I am from Mississippi.
I don't.
Business.
Okay, moving on from that. This stage is a stage of release,
Yeah.
right? But I prefer to look at it as the stage of forgiveness,
Yeah.
right? It's like 3 days after God done something cool,
Yeah.
they're already griping about, okay, I want water. Moses, why did you do this? And like, can we not trust God 3 days after a miracle? And you say, well, Chuck, I've never had a Red Sea parting in my life. And I would argue, oh, yeah, you have.
Yeah.
You just didn't see it for that.
Yeah.
Like I've seen God part waters for me when sometimes it was a creek, sometimes it was a river, and sometimes it was the Atlantic. But he's still in the water parting business. You just got to see it for what it is.
Yeah.
But to do that, you got to have this spirit of forgiveness in your life, because we'll take on so many offenses in this world. Julie and I did a podcast a few months ago about how to live an unoffendable life.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of our largest, listenerships. But I would say to you, as a believer, there are two things that I think are cool in this stage. One of them is, how do I become a man or woman who can live with no lies?
Yeah.
And how do I become a man or woman who can live in forgiveness?
Right.
Right?
That's hard.
Yeah, it's not easy. But I would even say, in your own power, it's impossible. But this is why that first stage of salvation is so cool.
Yeah.
Because apart from salvation, you've got no hope in this stage of release, this stage of forgiveness.
What's interesting in verse 22 is it says that Moses led them away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. And so physically they're moving,
Yeah.
but emotionally they're stuck.
Yeah.
And I think that word Mara, that means bitter, doesn't just apply to the water. It applied to many of their hearts.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
why we call this the stage of forgiveness, because there's going to be moments in our lives that God brings something to the surface, an old offense, an old wound, an old thing. And at this stage, it's as if God is saying it's time to cancel that debt.
Yeah.
It's time to walk into forgiveness. Now, this is hard, because all of us have those things, right? There's still things that when they happen in my life, it's like it triggers. It takes me way back 10, 20 years ago to some unresolved thing. And the tension for a lot of us is when preachers like us talk about forgiveness, sometimes we give the misconception that forgiveness is a once and for all thing. It's like, bring all of your junk, bring all of the stuff, and pray one prayer, and then it's gone.
Yeah, that's just not so.
The process of what God brings us through is, I think, certainly, maybe there's times like that, and God certainly could do that. But what I've found more experientially in my own life, and then by sitting with thousands of people over the years, kneecap to kneecap, talking about this, is I think often God will bring one thing at a time to the surface. And it may not be today. I mean, it's in different stages of our walk where God will bring something to the surface that maybe we ignored or we tried to stuff. It's sort of like when you go to the beach and you take one of those beach balls and you try to put it under the water. You might be able to hold it for a minute, but at some point it's going to bust out.
Yeah, right.
And if we never get through this stage of release where we begin to set free our captors or our debtors, man, it's going to do something to us. It doesn't mean what we're saying they did was right. What it is saying is we are applying the work of the cross to it.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
saying so long.
Yeah, for real. I want to add one thing to that, and that is, if you truly want to take a tragedy in your life and you want to kind of move that toward a triumph in your life, this stage of forgiveness is essential. But hear me, it's an inside job, y'all. This is not going to somebody and saying, hey, man, you wronged me and I forgive you. Oftentimes we treat that as a weapon, not as a part of forgiveness. Forgiveness is an inside job. It's the ability to genuinely let the presence of God give you the ability to forgive that is beyond your capacity. And here's the kicker. It is also there to help forgive you yourself. Because the greatest challenge most of us have is trying to learn how to forgive ourselves. Like, we beat the crud out of ourselves. Like, nobody in this room's perfect. I mean, none of us are even close. But when we learn to forgive ourselves, we're learning what the great commandment is really all about. Love God, how? With all you got. Love others in the same way. And then there's always a third part that we forget about, as you love yourself. And to do that, you got to learn to forgive. Jesus, I love this part where they're trying to catch him and they bring this woman caught in an act of adultery and it's like, kill her, kill her, kill her. They got the rocks in their hands, and Jesus bends down and he writes something. We don't know what he writes, but I've said it for years. I really do believe he wrote, watch this, And then he looks at it and says, okay, so if you've never done anything wrong, chunk the first rock, right? And they're like, oh, out of here. And they come to this realization how whacked out they are, right? Jesus does that. But then he looks at this woman and he says to her, sweet girl, you've been forgiven. Now just go and sin no more. Now we think he means go be perfect. That's not what the text says. The text is saying, let's learn from this and don't go do this again, right? Because she's still going to deal with junk. And the biggest junk, I promise you, that girl has to deal with is internally. Learn to forgive yourself the way God forgives you so you can love others appropriately. Salvation is required, and then you move to this second stage. And in that, I'll promise you, we have forgiveness that is powerful, which leads us to this third stage. It's a radical requirement.
Verses 22 and 23, and you read this, but it's so powerful. It says, then Moses led the people away from the Red Sea. They moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled in this desert for 3 days without finding any water. Verse 23. And Pastor Rhonda and the kids team, student team, and I got to hang out on Sawney Mountain yesterday with our rising sixth graders, which was a lot of fun. We just went a mile up the mountain. Now I was already looking for water. So imagine 3 days in the desert. I was
a little worried when I saw you that oxygen tank.
I thought we're taking our kids on an easy, I'd never been up Sawney Mountain somehow. And I thought it's going to be paved. It's going to be a piece of cake. I had no idea. It was real. So anyway, just a mile for these people, they're 3 miles. Look at verse 23. When they came to the oasis of Marah, the water was too bitter to drink. So they called the place Marah, meaning bitter. This stage of requirement is an important one. So it's a journey, right? Journey towards freedom starts with rescue. Have I been saved? It leads to release. Have I forgiven the offenses in my life? But the stage of requirement is really what we would call the stage of trust. The idea here is when you don't see a parted Red Sea right in front of you, are you still going to trust God? Even when things feel bitter, are you still going to trust God?
Right.
Even if you don't see his hand at work, will you trust his heart? And that song, that last song that we sang is so powerful because sometimes there are going to be mountaintops, but there's also going to be valleys.
Right.
And sometimes if we're not careful, sometimes because we're immature in our faith, sometimes because it's still new to us, when we don't see God's hand, we begin to wonder, God, are you even there?
That's so true.
And what happened in my own journey, and this has happened several times where I've had those moments where there seemed to be a mountain in the way of me seeing God, I would ask the question, God, where are you? God, where are you? God, where are you? I don't feel the excitement that I used to feel. I don't sense the answer to prayer that I used to feel. God, where are you? And what I found personally is the more I asked the question, God, where are you? The more distant God felt to me. And I don't know if that's true for you, but the more I asked why, or the more I asked where, the silenter heaven became. And I think in those moments, what God's asking us is, will you trust me?
Yeah.
There's not a great answer to God, why did this happen? But there is a great answer to the question, who can I trust in the middle of it? Who can I trust? That same God that parted the Red Sea, that same God that delivered them from Pharaoh, that same God, even when you can't see his hand, you can still trust his heart. And that's why I love what Pastor just said a moment ago. All of us have had some version of the Red Sea. We may not have acknowledged it. We may not have thought of the miracle of it. That's why starting every day with gratitude. That's why keeping a prayer journal of some sort. That's why reminding ourselves of the good things. It reminds us God has been faithful. God is going to be faithful. And so in the middle of this bitterness, the requirement from God is, trust me.
And the lesson that we would offer for you today, like you put in work, you put this in practice today throughout this week, and go ahead and just like take God at his word on this one, right? Just go ahead and insert that in your life. And here's the question. Are you praying for clarity? Are you praying for smooth roads? Are you praying for God to bless your plans? Are you praying for all that? And if so, here's what I'd challenge you to consider this week. Rather than praying for clarity or rather than praying for God's blessing, would you change that prayer and ask God to enlarge your trust, that he might do the work in you that will deliver those things? Oftentimes we got the chicken way ahead of the egg or the cart in front of the horse. And it's like, God, would you bless what I've got planned? Would you bless what I'm doing? And all the while, I think the Lord says, well, would you trust me? Would you just stinking trust me?
Yeah.
So in this stage, I mean, when you think about it, wow, salvation, forgiveness, trust. The heart of forgiveness is trust. The heart of salvation is trust. The heart of living the Christ life is trust. The whole power behind climbing the mountain is trust.
That's right.
Right? This is what we're longing for, which leads us to this next phase, which is refusal.
Yeah.
This whole stage of refusal. In verse 24, the text says, then the people complained and turned against Moses. What are we going to drink? They demanded. I mean, he brings them to the water, right? And then it's like, well, what should we drink? And you can tell it's been a long trip. I mean, 3 whole days. Wow. Right? And they're already whacked out, and they're looking at this, and it's like, okay, so this stage, at the end of the day, I think it's like, God, I know what you want me to do.
Yeah.
It's just not what I want to do.
Yeah.
Like, I know that if I would just have enough faith, if I could have enough trust, if I could just answer this thing I know gnawing inside of me, you want me to do, but God, I just don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Been there? It's like, I just don't want to do that. The reason I didn't come into a pastorate till the end, like so late in my life, is that I promised God I'd never do this. I mean, I still don't like preachers. And it's like, I don't want I don't want to look like one. I don't want to sound like one. I don't want to walk like one, because all I want to do is I just want God to do something cool.
Yeah.
I just want to see God do something cool. And I would just say to y'all, this stage becomes a stage of obedience. Am I willing to obey? Watch this. Salvation comes, forgiveness happens, trust is enlarged, and with greater trust, obedience is far easier. Like here, this is, y'all have heard me say this before, but hear how the text might read, Bobby. By God, if you would love me, you would keep my commandments. Arr! You ever heard it like that? When I was a kid, that's why I heard a preacher unload that one on me. It's like, dude, calm down, right? And then I wasn't in my 40s till I heard a guy say, what if it sounded like this? You know, when you discover how easy it is to love me, it'll be so much easier to follow my commandments. It's like, it had this radical shift in my life.
That's right. Because
now obedience happens, and it's okay, y'all, listen, we said this a few weeks ago, it's okay to question your faith. It's okay, God, I can question, where are you? It's okay to question what's going on in my life. It's okay to question, do I really believe what I believe? It's okay. God's big enough to handle all of that. It is okay to fight with God. But here's the rule. As long as you know he's always going to win.
That's right.
Right? And this is when trust is enlarged in our life, and obedience becomes so easy.
Yeah, so good. So I hope you're seeing the journey, right? It's not a one-time event. It's not overnight. There's this process God brings us through, and this next stage of the process is what we call the stage of renewal. Listen to this, verse 25. So the people are, they're angry. They're like, where's the water? And then when they get the water, they're bitter about the water because the water's bitter. And it says in chapter 15, verse 25, so Moses cried out to the Lord for help. And the Lord showed him a piece of wood. And Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good to drink. It was there at Marah that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. What's amazing in this moment is while they're grumbling, God points to a tree. While they're bitter and angry, God points to a tree. And I just can't help but to keep making that connection. When we're grumbling, when we're bitter, when we're stuck, God also points to a tree. He points to the cross.
Yeah.
And I think it's at this stage in our journey that we begin to take the work of the cross and we begin to apply it to the details of our life. Another way of saying this is learning to walk in the Spirit of God.
Yeah.
To quit trying to figure it all out with our head. There's nothing wrong with being intellectual. There's nothing wrong with being active and engaging. But there is something about pausing and saying, God, would you lead me? God, would you lead me? And this stage of the journey is when we switch our strengths and we quit saying, God, I can do it by myself, to saying, God, I can't, but you can't. Yeah. This is the stage of renewal where we apply the work of the cross to our life.
But so listen, if you go backward, like, okay, salvation, okay, I get heaven, awesome, right? Yeah. Okay, but that requires forgiveness? I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, listen, if you'll acknowledge me before others, I will acknowledge you before the Father, right? This is the power of forgiveness. If you want to be forgiven, forgive, right? I mean, this is the way it works. Okay, but now I have to trust. I mean, you got to trust when things are totally just, my whole life's off the rails? Yes. Why? Because this is easier to obey. Well, when I obey, what am I living? I'm living Matthew 5, the Beatitudes, blessed are, which could be translated, happy is. You're here looking for a happy life. I want to be happy. I want to be at peace. I want to enjoy my journey. Okay, well, look at the path. Trust Jesus with your life, salvation.
Yeah.
Learn to accept his forgiveness of your sin so that you might forgive you of your sin and you might forgive others.
Yeah.
When that happens, I find this radical ability to trust him more even when my life is off the rails. And when I trust him more, obedience isn't like a rule book. It's like, I want to do this because I am blessed radically through it.
That's right.
And with that obedience, then comes to this stage where I can apply all this to my life, and the cross is where I run to when my life is off the rails, because at the cross is where the whole thing started. Yeah. I don't have salvation apart from Jesus shedding his blood on an old rugged cross. Yeah. I don't have forgiveness from that. I have no hope to be trusting. I cannot obey unless I come back to the cross. So this is not a linear thing. It's not a checklist. For those of you that are like did I just say that right?
I don't know.
I think I just cussed in church. That is awesome.
Our YouTube numbers through the roof this week.
I'm going to be on that YouTube channel that says sermons you can't get out of your head. I just said spreadsheet. That is hilarious. I can't believe I said that. Welcome home, Sydney.
In case you didn't say it, you just did say it.
Well, I wanted to be clear.
All right, good.
I'm not even going to try to say the right one now. If you got a checklist mindset,
it's not linear.
Come on, that's funny. I don't care who you are. So,
mark this day down. Memorial Day weekend.
I had such a good point there.
Yeah. It is a good point. It is that reminder.
You're trying to bail me out, aren't you?
I'm trying to. Obviously, I'm a point guy, and I like but life is rarely as nice and neat as an outline. Are you tracking with me? It's messy. Like, sometimes your marriage is messy, sometimes your prayer is messy, sometimes your pastor cusses and that gets messy.
Jenny always said it would happen one of these days. Yeah, I'm sorry, baby.
Here's the last stage, and then we're just going to ask you the question, where are you in the process? The last stage is what we call the stage of regulation, and there's really two words here. Let me read the verses to you again. So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and then here's what it says. The Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw that into the water, and he made the water good to drink. It was there at Marah that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard. So here's the standard, guys. Like, here's how you test your faithfulness to him. So if you're asking the question, where's the yardstick of my faith? I think this is a great one. Verse 26. He said, if you will listen carefully, right? So here's part one of this, listen. And that's a good word for us. I was talking to somebody recently on FaceTime, and I could tell somewhere along the way they were distracted and they were sort of looking off. And then I noticed in their glasses, I could see the reflection that they were on one device talking to me, on the other device they were playing a game.
I'm
right?
sorry.
So there's something about listening, right? So part one is we got to learn to listen. And then he says, listen carefully to the voice of the Lord, your God. And then look at this next part, and do what is right. So here's the litmus test at the stage of regulation is, will I listen to God and will I obey him?
Yeah.
Listen and obey. Yeah. Listen and obey. And one of the ways that we can measure our faith, there's a lot of ways, but one of the ways that we can measure our faith is to look at how much time goes by between those two things. For some of us, we've listened for a lot of years to something God's been saying, but it's been weeks, months, maybe even years, and we still haven't obeyed.
I believe there are people that literally are in that stage for decades. Because some preacher somewhere said, hey, trust Jesus for heaven.
Yeah.
And now it's like, okay, well, I'm just waiting.
Yeah.
And you missed this glorious opportunity of living an obedient life that leads us to a more holy and genuinely gracious lifestyle with Christ, because we cannot do it alone. I don't care how nice a person you are, apart from Christ, it doesn't happen, right? So I guess what Bobby and I have before we wrap up with a final question is this one thought. Today, do you need to return to the cross? I mean, like in the simplicity of your life, do you need to return? Like God says to Moses, grab this piece of wood, chunk it in the bitter water, and what happened? It became sweet. I mean, then later on in verse 27, they move on where they're a place where there's 12 fresh springs and palm trees, and it's like you feel the goodness of God, but they needed to know what bitter water was like so they could know what sweet water tasted like.
That's right.
But I find it interesting, like Pastor Bobby said, God pointed to a piece of wood to fix the problem.
Yeah.
Today, you might need to go back to an old rugged cross to fix the problem.
That's right.
To discover I need to get back into this ever-going process. It is not linear. You know, as much as I love a good checkbox, man, this is something that happens daily. It happens moment by moment, where I continue to figure out, how do I trust more? How do I obey? And in this, when things fall apart, where do I run back? So the question that we would have for you today is, what stage are you in?
Yeah. Where are you?
Where are you at right now? It's probably worth just a brief self-inspection. So here's what I'd ask you to do: is just like, go ahead, just bow your head, close your eyes. I want us to take a moment just of quietude, and just focus your brain on God. Would you reveal to me exactly where I'm at in this process?
Yeah.
And if you do need to return back to the cross, or for the first time go to the cross, hear that prayer that I prayed. Jesus, would you forgive me?
Yeah.
And I believe you died for me and rose for me so that I could accept and believe that for the forgiveness of my sin.
Yeah.
And I want to turn my life around. I want to live for you. Would you step into my life and be my Lord, be my Savior, because I need your salvation. Maybe that's where you clarify that today.
Yeah.
Maybe you're at a point where it's like, God, I got to figure out how to forgive. Man, I'm holding on to bitterness or rage or anger, even if it's toward yourself. Maybe in your life, it's like, God, I want to trust you, but I don't even know how to ask. And maybe right now you want to say, God, would you fill me with the ability to trust you?
Yeah.
And maybe you're like me today. It's like, God, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I like my plan better than yours. And God's saying, but you know I'm going to win, right? Just jump on board. So wherever you're at in all these steps, know that. And I think, Pastor Bobby, the second question is, in the moment of quietude, really question yourself, am I willing to do that? Am I willing to get back in this circle and in this process, to run back to the cross, to forgive, to trust, to obey, to act on it? Am I willing to do that? Like if you were to gauge that on a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 is I'm willing to do anything, but 1 is no, I like my own life. Ask yourself, what's your number?
Yeah.
Where am I at? And whatever that number is, ask the Lord to enlarge it.
Yeah.
Because I think, Pastor, you said this a minute ago, that the only choice today is to choose to move forward.
Yeah.
Because that is the way to the cross, to always move toward Him.
That's right.
Heavenly Father, you're a good and a gracious God. Lord, I know there are people in this room struggling to forgive themselves. There are people in this room trying to forgive others. I believe there's people in this room trying to struggle whether you could actually forgive them. but you are a good and a gracious God. So today, for those folks that would say, Jesus, I need you, I pray they just join in that prayer and say, God, I'm calling on your name right now. And you do what you always say you do, that you will hear them and answer them, and I thank you for that. For folks right now that are dealing with forgiveness of others, and in particular forgiving themselves, overwhelm them with the power to do that. Lord, for all of us that struggle with trusting in you, especially when life is difficult, maybe for some of us because things are too good, God, soak us to the core with the ability to trust you. For those of us that are trying to act in obedience and say, God, I will. God, if you have to, grab us by the earlobe and shout into us to remind us that our obedience always leads to goodness for our life. And God, as a church, let us be a people that never forget who you are, what you've done, and what you've called us to do. So we'll praise you on the mountain, and we'll praise you in the mountains in the way, because you're good all the time. In the name of Jesus we pray. And everyone said, would you stand for a minute? We're not going to sing our way out today, but I wanted to leave you with the blessing. But before I do, I want to remind you, man, this Memorial Day, I don't know that I'm an American exceptionalist. I don't even know if I buy all that stuff. But I'm going to tell you something. We really do live in the greatest country on the planet. Can you believe, with all the junk that's wrong with us, we have the freedoms to do it? Nobody busted us for going to worship the Lord today. Nobody busted me for carrying a red Bible to church today. I can go pray for people anywhere. That's the goodness of God, y'all. But there are also families out there that tomorrow's going to be brutal because somebody in their family gave their life so me and you could enjoy that. While you're grilling out, slapping cheese on a burger with onions and some jalapeno, bless the Lord. Remember, man, there are women and men out there that are still fighting for you to be able to enjoy it. What an awesome thing that we live in a country like this. So this Jesus we've talked about today, he ain't playing around. He's never on holiday. He never slumbers. He never sleeps. He is always for you, and he will never not be for you. You can't make him not love you. And if you choose to, you can choose this day to let him go before you and make a way and make your crooked path straight, because that's what he does.